Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Growth and Gratitude podcast. I am so honored and thrilled to have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Janice Gassam Asare. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me here, Bridget. You said my name perfectly. I could tell you practice that, or your public speaking skills are impeccable because you said that perfectly.
You
I'm
are
so
too
excited
kind
to be here.
Thank you. You are too kind, but actually you get the credit because on your LinkedIn, you can just click on your picture and you have a recorded intro to yourself and you say your name. So I watched that several times.
You did. I love that you did your research because sometimes people just butcher it, even though I have the phonetic spelling in my email and in multiple places. Sometimes people just don't do that research. So I really appreciate that you took the time to listen to that to make sure you got the pronunciation correctly. It was perfect.
Of course. And I think that speaks to what we're going to get into, which is really diversity and getting to know each other and learn about each other and really honor each other's not just names, but cultures and identities and experiences in the world. And so we're going to get into a lot of that. But on this podcast, we always start with gratitude. It's growth and gratitude. And our growth topic is clearly going to be anti-racism, racial equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Very important conversation. But Janice, what are you grateful for right here in this moment?
I love the shift or the starting the conversation with gratitude. That's a really great question. I would say I'm excited and grateful for this conversation. Any opportunity I'm given to just share more about myself and share more about the work that I do is one that I'm grateful for. So I would definitely say this conversation, and for you, I'll get into it, but just how we met and being able to work with you was wonderful. I am grateful for the nap that I was able to take before this conversation. I woke up, checked my watch, and I saw I had an hour before my alarm was going to go off, and I just couldn't fall back asleep. And so around noon, I started feeling tired. So I was like, let me see if I could take a nap. Sometimes it's hard, but I fell right asleep and I took about an hour nap. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm grateful to see that there is, even though there's an anti-DEI movement that is growing, I'm grateful to still see a lot of interest in this work and to still see companies reaching out for speaking engagements, and for a lot of people are doing conferences in September and October. So I'm really grateful for that because the summer was tough, and with the affirmative action and what happened with that was just really tough to see. So I'm grateful to see that there's still that interest there.
Yeah, me too. Excellent. I agree with everything you shared. I feel so strongly about the need to continue these conversations. I think some of us get lazy and just kind of go, oh, I know about that. I've studied that. I've put in my time, and it's never enough. And it's got to be top of mind constantly, in my opinion. And I love that you took a nap. I am such a fan of naps.
Yes, I should have actually said I was thankful for my Fitbit. My husband got me a Fitbit when we first met, and I'd never had any sort of smartwatch. And I'm obsessed with it now. And we've traveled last month, and I got my Fitbit wet. And so I didn't get a chance to replace it. I just kept saying I would. And I like to track my sleep on there and the steps that I walk. And I just felt lost without one. I ordered one, and there was defective, and I plugged it in, I charged it, and it never turned on. And I just was so frustrated. So I went to Best Buy yesterday, and I was just I need a Fitbit. And they didn't have the same one that I wanted, but I just need one to track my sleep and my steps, and that's it. So I found one, and so that's the other thing I should have said I'm grateful for, because tracking my naps is much easier with the watch.
Oh, I might be sold. I haven't been sold on the Fitbit yet, but if you can track your naps as well as your activity and all the other things that I tend to think of when I think of those devices, I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the whole being.
Apple Watch is a lot for me. I don't like to get notifications all the time, But I think the Fitbit is simple enough to where it tells you the health stuff. And then the other stuff, if you want, I think it'll give you notifications, but not too deeply.
Okay. Well, good to know. You are just a wealth of information. Because I think this is important. And I know you and I really care deeply about the whole person and wellness and self-care so that we can show up and do the kind of work
Yeah,
that you do in the world. You have to take really good care of yourself because it can be incredibly taxing. So
absolutely.
this is actually really relevant to what we're talking about today. I want to take a couple minutes to introduce you, and I will not be able to say everything because there's so much. I'm kind of starstruck when I look at your profiles and your biography, and I feel so honored that you sort of found me and that we ended up, well, let's just let people know how we know each other first, and then I'll introduce you, because you are doing such meaningful work. When I see you I just looked at your LinkedIn, and one of your last posts has like 2,000 likes. Okay. You just have a huge following. You're a top voice on LinkedIn. You did your second TEDx talk. You have your third book coming out. You're just a leader in the field. The name is changing, the acronym DEIJ, I've noticed: diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. So we'll talk about that. But before I get into your formal introduction, I'm just so honored. How the heck did you find me, and how did we end up working together?
Yeah, so you were actually my TEDx coach for my second TED Talk.
Yes.
And I just Googled. So I had submitted to do a few TED Talks. And when I got an acceptance email, I was so excited. And I knew that I wanted my second to be better than my first TEDx. And I was like, I would love a coach. So I just Googled, I think I did TEDx coach or how to create a TEDx from a book or something, right? Because I wanted to tie my book into the TEDx. And I saw a podcast interview that you did. And I think I contacted you on LinkedIn. I think your business on Instagram. She might be like me, and I'm not good with checking Instagram messages. And I think I'd seen you were pretty active, or you had commented on something on LinkedIn. So I was like, okay, good. So she's active. So I sent you a message, and then we started working together, and then the rest is history. But I think it was just through a Google search. So the podcast you were on, the topic you were talking about, you were one of the first things that popped up on Google.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't know if we've talked about this in this depth before, because it's so good to know, as I'm sure you always want to know how people find their way to you. So interesting. That podcast was with Anna David. I'm sure that's the one you're talking about, which was about how to turn your book into a TED Talk or a TEDx talk. And I'm so grateful to her. Shout out to Anna for doing that podcast, because she has a massive following. And I got a lot of response from folks who wanted to work with me then in turning their books into a TEDx talk. So it's nice to know that that was how it started. And then you found me on LinkedIn. And when we first talked and you first told me about what your book was about and what you were planning to give a TEDx talk on, I said, I am in. I was just so honored that you found me and that we got to do such meaningful work together on that particular TED Talk. And I thank you. I thank you for trusting me. And that work was incredibly rewarding. And I cannot wait to see your TED Talk, which hasn't come out yet. But when it does, we're going to make sure that everybody listening knows it may be out by the time this comes out. So look in the show notes here and in the description on YouTube to see if it's out. You've got to see it. It's spectacular. She had it ready to go by the time she came to me for coaching. We just did some fine tuning and practicing.
I tried to practice it to the point where I knew it by heart, which is not what I did for my first TEDx. I had a PowerPoint and I was just going with the flow. I think as somebody who has experience, I know you have experience with teaching as well. I think it helps with just being able to talk on the fly. But that practice that I did with you was so immensely helpful. So I think if anyone needs public speaking coaching that's listening, you're definitely a great resource for people to reach out to.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's some of the most meaningful work I do, because the most important thing is for everybody's voices to be heard. And if somebody has a message they want to put out into the world to make the world a better place, which you certainly do, any role that I can play in supporting that and helping people to do that and to be heard by more folks, I'm all in. So I'm so honored again. And now let me introduce you to our amazing guest today, Dr. Janice Gassam Asare. She's an organizational psychologist. She specializes in helping workplaces create environments that are safe and free from harm for minoritized and racially marginalized employees. She is the author of 2 best-selling books, Dirty Diversity and The Pink Elephant. And I'm so excited to say that by the time this episode comes out, her 3rd book will be out end of October, Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace, a guide for equity and inclusion. And I want every one of you to get that book immediately. And we're hoping that her TED Talk will be out. So make sure you look for that. And if it's not out when this podcast is out, it will be out shortly after. And I will go back and add that link into the description and show notes so that whenever you're listening to this, make sure to check for it because it will be in there. Now, I already mentioned earlier, thousands of likes on your LinkedIn post, but you are a top voice on LinkedIn. When you post on LinkedIn, you just have endless comments and endless likes and so much engagement. You have over 400 or more Forbes articles that you've written. I just tried to pull some. In your Udemy course, you have 400 students. Your LinkedIn course, you have 6,000 learners. 60 people have mentioned you in their writing and research papers. All these numbers are probably have gone up just in the time since I've found them. You're so well known and highly regarded and out there in the world speaking on this very, very important topic. So is there anything I left out? I wanted to say you help workplaces become anti-racist. You're a DEI consultant, 2-time TEDx speaker, just in case anybody missed any of that. What else? What have I left out?
I think that was an amazing, thank you for all the flowers and for just the amazing intro. I think you covered everything. And I love listening to audiobooks. That's probably the only thing that we miss, but you hit the nail on the head with everything.
Me too. Is your book going to be in audiobook form?
Yes, and we're currently trying to figure out if I'm going to be the reader, which I would prefer, or if it's going to be someone else. But if it's someone else, I really want to make sure they have the right voice for this particular type of book. So
Yes.
there will definitely be an audio version.
Excellent. Well, I would love to listen to the audio version, especially if you end up reading it. I understand there's a lot to consider there, but you have an incredible voice and energy that comes through. So if that does end up happening, I would be excited. But I'm sure it'll be a great person if it's not you, and I look forward to listening to the audiobook. I just want to start by asking for you to tell us about your work. Tell us about what's most important to you in your work. What do you do? Why do you do it? Who do you do it for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely do it for the most marginalized employees. I would love to say that my work is just for leaders, because a lot of what I do is I consult with leaders and I partner with leaders and I help them to provide guidance for creating more equitable environments. But it's really for like the most marginalized employees, where I felt in a lot of spaces where I didn't have a voice to really impact change in the workplace. So I think I also do it for me when I was in those spaces and I felt like there was no one really advocating for me. And so I'm really grateful to have worked with so many companies, whether it's providing a workshop or a training, or even just working closely with leaders or their employee resource group to help them figure out what are the specific issues employees are experiencing, and then how can we create policies and practices that address these specific issues, or maybe what are the ways our policies and practices are discriminating unintentionally against certain populations of employees. So it's been really interesting because there's been chatter on LinkedIn with some people saying, is DEI or DEIJ officially dead? And I think that it's a really interesting conversation, but as long as there's people and we all have differences, we all have so many unique identities, this work will never not be needed. And so I think that it's very taxing work, but it's work that I know needs to be done. So I think that kind of in a nutshell highlights the work that I do with organizations and institutions.
Thank you. And just for everybody out there, if you need some DEIJ work in your organization, I just can't even imagine a better person to talk with about what's
Thank you.
needed. Yeah, what are the challenges and how can we address those challenges head on? I was wondering if there are specific examples you might be able to provide. And I know we have to be really careful. People like you and me have to sign a lot of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. So we
Yeah.
have to be really careful what we say. But I know from being a consultant in so many organizations over 30 years, microaggressions, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and transphobia. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It's rampant. It
Mhm.
is, I mean, it is just in the air that everyone's breathing. What are some of the examples, if you can think of any, that stand out without giving anything away, that people can be more mindful about and be aware of
Mhm.
and be careful to see and to
Mhm.
do whatever they can to prevent or address or
Mhm.
confront?
There was a really interesting situation that happened on LinkedIn, and I had a chance to interview this person, and her post went viral. I think it had about 20 or 30,000 views on LinkedIn, but she shared that she is of Indian descent. She works at a company. She submitted the paperwork or an email to go on bereavement leave because her uncle passed away. And her company denied her of bereavement leave because they said, based on their company's policy, uncles are not immediate family members. And what she explained to me was in her culture, uncles and aunts and even grandparents are play a really pivotal role in the family structure. And what was interesting is she shared with me in her work policy, in the bereavement policy, they included step parents, stepchildren, and she said in Indian culture, divorce is not common. So here was a policy that was created with a very sort of Eurocentric white family structure in mind that didn't take into consideration cultural differences. And it's something that who's thinking of their company's bereavement policy until they unfortunately have to use it. So I think that that was a really, really clear example of the ways that bias is baked into the fabric of workplace policies. I heard a story about a young Black girl who worked at Chick-fil-A, and she had similar to what the hairstyle that I have, she had blonde braids, and she was told by her manager she had to change her hair to a natural hair color, and she refused, and so she was fired. And so even things like that where there's a policy in place but it's not always equally applied to everyone. And so I see a lot of that where there might be a policy in place and employees feel like, well, I have to go through all these hoops before I take time off. This company encourages mental health and mental well-being. But then when I request time off, my manager asks me why. I have to fill out paperwork. I have to do all of this. And people, we all go through different things. If someone is going through a personal experience, or even for the people with periods who have very, very sort of intense periods and menstruation cycles, you might not want to tell your boss that it's the time of the month. You're going through a very bad period this particular month. You shouldn't have to like reveal all the ins and outs of your life in order to get time off if mental health and mental well-being is something that a company encourages. So I see a lot of times policies that on the surface seem very neutral, but when you sort of peel back the layers, okay, it's causing undue hardship or it's unfair to certain employees. So I see a lot of that. And then as you mentioned, microaggressions is a really, really big thing. And a lot of times it just comes down to people's lack of understanding and awareness, and the company not investing enough time and energy in educating employees. I don't know everything there is to know about every topic, and I make mistakes. I've said things and done things oh, that language is ableist, for example. I shouldn't have said, I used to use blind spots a lot. That was my word. When I was doing my work, I would say, we have to be mindful of our blind spots. And I learned a few years ago that that particular term is ableist. And so we're all engaging in microaggressions every day, all the time. But what can our workplaces do to help us understand and widen our awareness? And I don't think that there's enough investment that companies make when it comes to that. But I think personally, we can all consistently be trying to learn about groups and cultures outside of our own, because in reading and listening to different perspectives, that's how I learn about what could be considered a microaggression or what could be considered bias or an exclusionary behavior. So I think it's really important that we are also taking it upon ourselves to consistently learn about experiences outside of our own.
Excellent examples. Thank you. That's exactly what I was hoping for. And those don't even address like unconscious bias. Those are policy. Those are things that are, yeah, that are really causing problems just because they're in some policy manual somewhere. Well, actually, that's probably then combined with inherent bias and unconscious bias that people aren't even aware of, how they're applying these things differently, or they're not taking into account an individual's unique experience and needs. And that's what equity is. Equity is, I'm thinking of that bicycle analogy where it's, you don't give everybody the same bicycle. You know, one person needs a taller one, a shorter one, a person in a wheelchair needs something different. That brought up so many other examples that came to mind for me, but we'll let yours stand and just say that both you and I could probably share for hours and hours these kinds of situations that we see where it's just not taking into account the diversity of what people need to be to have their basic minimum rights and needs met in their workplace. So I want to ask a little bit about your new book, if you don't mind sharing with us, because I think it's a lifelong process. But when I was teaching, we both have been professors at a university, and it's a whole different world there studying these kinds of things. And in some ways better, and in some ways not, and I'm sure we could have a long conversation about that. But I did a lot of work, and I assigned students a lot of work around whiteness and understanding white privilege, and way back from, I don't know if you, Peggy McIntosh's article.
Peggy McIntosh,
I was assigning that for many years, but I think people don't understand what that means and how deeply we need to forever be looking at that, and how whiteness is centered in our world. What does whiteness mean? That how can we understand what that means, and how powerful it is, and how just implicit it is in everything? And then what do you mean? Maybe just kind of a little tiny idea of what you mean by decentering whiteness, which is the title of your new book that's coming out, Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace.
Yeah, when I think about whiteness, I think it's important for us to think about whiteness as a system that doesn't require white people necessarily. When I told a close friend of mine I was coming out with this book called Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace, her first reaction was, okay, so you're writing a book for white people, right? And this was a Black person that asked this, and I had to sort of explain to her that whiteness is a system. It's not, I'm not talking specifically about white people, because Black people can also uphold whiteness. White people aren't the only ones that have internalized whiteness. I think we've all sort of internalized it because it's the air that we breathe and the water that we drink. So when we're like writing up a policy, we have like the nuclear family that we were all taught about, with the 2 kids and the 1 boy, 1 girl, and the dog. And that's like, when we think about the nuclear family, we're creating policies around that. How many of us actually have the nuclear family? All of us have very unique family structures. And so when I think about whiteness, I think it's important for us to think about systems and the ways that our systems and structures prioritize white people to the detriment of other communities and groups. So when we are creating hiring practices, we are unconsciously looking at a person's name. And if the name sounds like it's a Muslim name, for example, then I'm going to be less likely to hire this person than if it's a white name. They did a study with Swedish job applicants, and they looked at those with Arab sounding names and those with Swedish sounding names. And they found that, unsurprisingly, those with Arab sounding names received fewer callbacks. They've replicated that and they've done those types of studies with Black and white names, and Black resumes or names with Black sounding names have fewer callbacks. And so when we think about whiteness, it's the ways that it's really pervasive in our system. But I also try to talk about in the book how whiteness also harms white people. And so whiteness strips us of our culture. White people or people from different European countries, if you come from England, if you come from Scotland, if you come from Ireland, you had a culture. But to come to America and have to denounce your culture and your structure to now become white, because when the European colonists came here, there was no white or Black. It was just, oh, you were Scottish, oh, you were Italian. But we had to at some point, or people had to at some point become white. And in that becoming of white, we all sort of lost ourselves and lost our culture and lost who we are. And it's interesting because my mom always says, my parents are from Cameroon, and my mom always says, oh, America, they say it's like the melting pot, but you actually have to lose yourself. It's not like you come and you bring your culture to the table. You have to strip yourself of everything you've ever known to become American and to take on an American identity. So I think that whiteness also harms white people. And I think when we think about whiteness as a system, looking at the environment, one thing I recently learned more about was environmental racism and how people from certain communities are more likely to live in hazard zones. If you're a person of color, you're more likely to live in an area with more pollution. You're more likely to live in an area with fewer trees, which I didn't know. And if you have fewer trees, it gets hotter during the summer. You have less of the trees to cool down the area. So even things like that, and how we've deemed certain parts of the world, okay, this neighborhood is a hazard zone. We can dump our waste here and pollute, but we all share a world. So we're all impacted by what happens in the world. And I think that climate and environmental racism is impacting all of us. So I really wrote the book to show how whiteness is so deeply embedded in our workplace systems, because when I started writing the book, or I thought to write it, I didn't see a lot of books that focus specifically on whiteness as a system in the workplace. I know there was a lot of books that deal with white supremacy in society, how to address the inner white supremacy within us, and things like that. But I didn't specifically see a book that looked at what is whiteness in the workplace, what are the ways that whiteness is centered, and how do we decenter whiteness. So I talk about my experiences being in academia, and I worked in a small private university in Connecticut, and it was mostly white. And I remember being in meetings and feeling like I would provide an idea, and my colleagues, who were mostly white men, would cut me off. And I wasn't even able to get my full thought out before somebody would talk over me or someone would cut me off. And so, how is whiteness centered in meetings? We know that men are much more likely to interrupt women, but women of color are so much more interrupted. Their thoughts are overlooked. They experience tone policing in the workplace. And so even in meetings, what are the ways that whiteness is centered? And then the book provides details on how to actively decenter whiteness. There is an activity called the round robin technique that I've seen some companies implement, where instead of having just a regular meeting where you go through the agenda items, you go through the agenda items and then each person has a designated time to speak. So it might be like, okay, Bridget has 2 minutes, Tom has 2 minutes, this person has 2 minutes, I have 2 minutes. And when your time is done, then you listen to the next person, so that there isn't one person that's sort of over talking in the meeting, which, as you and I both know, in the classroom, this happens a lot, where I have some students that are very talkative and then other students that don't get an opportunity to share. So I go through in each chapter a workplace system, like our hiring processes and ways whiteness is centered, and then how to actively decenter whiteness in those processes. So I'm actually very excited that it's coming out at the end of October, because the era that we're in now is one in which I think DEI, there's a growing anti-DEI movement, and things are becoming a little bit more volatile, it feels like. So I'm really excited for the book.
I'm excited too, and I thank you for writing it, and I'll be sharing it widely and telling everyone about it. And I think much like a lot of what's happening in the world today, as I think you know, my daughter and I run transgender school, and we try to educate people about transgender identities and experiences and the diversity in the community. And we've been doing that for several years. We've seen more hate in the last year than all the other years combined, than anything I've seen in my life. Things are really coming to a head around diversity, where the side against, who thinks everything's just fine the way it is and everybody's treated equally, and then those of us who are really trying to work towards social justice in general and then specific areas. So we need more. We need more of this work. We need to speak up louder. We need to keep the conversations going. We need to keep pushing for training and workshops and coaching and much, much more work in this area. So you have my word that I will do everything I can to get your book in as many hands and companies as I can. And this episode is just the beginning of that. Of course, you have the academic background, you have the consulting credibility with so much important work. And at the same time, some of the suggestions you're making just make so much sense and seem so practical. And as you were saying, like, just do round robin, just give everybody 2 minutes. That just makes so much sense. Yet I still find myself in meetings where, I'm sorry, the white males are dominating. And I can absolutely see that the people of color, and especially the women of color, are not being given the same amount of airtime. And maybe I know I'm less likely to speak up just because I've been conditioned and socialized as a woman to hear everybody else out first and make sure I'm not too loud or too confrontational. We know all those implicit biases are under all that. So why can't we just implement systems like what you're talking about that at least make it less likely for those things to happen? So are there a couple of other suggestions like that that people can take away?
So one thing that I'm always an advocate for is anonymous resumes. I know some people say, oh, we don't like to do this because we like to prioritize people from different communities and backgrounds. And sometimes you can look at someone's name and tell where they're from. But I've been on hiring committees before, and I see how a person's background, looking at their name, looking at their affiliations, looking at the university that they went to, all of those things can influence how credible or how professional or how intelligent we think a person is. And so I think anonymous resumes, so having somebody who is at smaller companies, it's easy. You could just have an intern or someone taking white out, if it's a white resume, taking white out and marking through any sort of demographic identifier. So removing the name, removing age is big. So even on my LinkedIn, I don't have the years that I graduated, because I think that can cause age discrimination, where if someone sees, oh, you graduated high school in 1960, now I can start calculating your age, and no, I don't want to give you the job. So removing things like any sort of age indicators, removing if you're part of like a religious, any sort of religious affiliations or organizations that maybe you volunteered with or you've worked with, I would remove that. Also removing anything that would indicate a racial or ethnic identifier, and looking at resumes in that way, because often we prioritize what university a person went to. And we know that based on what I imagine we'll see happening after the overturning of affirmative action, a lot of different racialized communities don't have an equal opportunity to get admission into these quote unquote elite institutions. So if we're prioritizing someone who went to Yale over somebody that didn't go to Yale, that's still our inherent biases that are creeping in and influencing our hiring decisions. So I would definitely say anonymous resumes can be a really powerful way. And then something as simple, Bridget, as are you actually evaluating resignation letters? A lot of us, before we leave a job, will provide a resignation letter, but people don't actually put them all together, right? If you have 50 resignation letters from the last year, put them all together and look for themes. Are people who are leaving the organization specifically citing a particular issue? Are they saying it's a lack of pay equity? Are they saying it's microaggressions from a manager? Are they saying they feel a lot of ambiguity in their role? What are people saying when they leave the company? And I think out of formality, a lot of companies require a resignation letter or they have exit interviews, but they don't actually sit back and take that information. And that's a lot of great information. If someone is providing you a letter, oftentimes they'll tell you why they're leaving the organization. And so I think those are a few things that organizations can start to think about. They're not very costly, that you can start to think about doing. The round robin technique is free. The reviewing resignation letters is free. And then the anonymous resumes, if you're at a larger organization, I'm sure like a Google or an Amazon, there's so many systems you could pay for, but a smaller organization, hiring like a paid intern to remove all of those demographics from a resume is a great way to give them experience and also make your process more equitable.
These are practical yet incredibly meaningful recommendations that organizations need to listen to send a message to their employees that they care and that they really are taking steps to ensure inclusion and equity. What you said about resignation letters, and yeah, that's data. That's hard data. You can
Yeah.
start looking at what are the problems and what are we not addressing? Where do we need
Yeah.
to put some attention? And I just want to add to that, because as a coach, I'm an executive coach as well as a public speaking coach. I cannot tell you how many clients I've coached, and clients of color and women, who are absolutely on the receiving end of bias, of unfair bias that's keeping them from getting promoted, from not being heard, that's causing all kinds of obstacles for them in their career that have absolutely nothing to do with their capability and their qualifications and their hard work. Darn it, organizations, you need to make it safer for those people to go to someone in
Mhm.
HR, because
Yeah.
I just have to say I've been really disappointed in general, not always. There are the exceptions with the response that those claims are met with. I don't know what your
Yeah.
thoughts are about that. And maybe I'm going too far in saying that, because I know there are a
No.
lot of humans in those organizations trying to help people, but what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% spot on. So I used to teach in an HR program. And so most of my graduates would get their master's in HR management and then go into an HR department if they weren't working in HR already. And what was sad to me is the only sort of equity training that they received was my course in DEI. But what a lot of HR professionals deal with is not just the sort of talent acquisition, the paperwork aspect of HR, but it's dealing with interpersonal issues. And the problem is a lot of HR professionals have very little training on interpersonal issues, interracial issues, and all. They don't have conflict resolution experience. And these are all things that HR professionals should be equipped with, because they're often the first places that employees that experience harm are going to. And a lot of times HR is not, they're not equipped to handle that. A lot of the DEI work has now fallen on HR professionals because a lot of companies are cutting their DEI funding and their DEI budgets. So it's just such a precarious sort of position. How do we train the HR professionals? But that's where someone like an external consultant can come in and train the HR department on those things, because they are the first line of defense. But a lot of people feel like they can't trust HR.
Mhm. Exactly. Bring people like Dr. Gassam Asare in to help you with this, because it's not simple. It's complicated, and the way you respond can make all the difference. And for
Yeah,
people to be met with, "Oh, it's not about that. I'm sure it's something else," or "You're
yeah,
just imagining this," or "Oh no, that person has a perfectly clean record and they wouldn't do something like that." I've just heard it all, and it's heartbreaking, because people know what they're experiencing. I think that we have to be very mindful of how we respond to these kinds of things happening in the workplace. And there's a lot of
absolutely.
work needed around that. And I hope people will seek your support. All right. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I could talk to you forever.
Yeah, I
I
know. I
think
feel like this is such a great conversation.
yes, yes. So maybe we'll come back at some point
Yeah,
later and do a part two because there's so much to learn and it's constantly changing and evolving and we're
yeah.
learning more. And so is there anything that you feel is important to share that I didn't get a chance to ask you about that you'd really like people to know?
I think it's important that we recognize that there's small things in our own life that we can all do to make the world a better place and to push equity forward. That might be just picking up a book to expand your awareness about a particular topic. It might be speaking on behalf of somebody in your workplace whose voice is has not been heard. It could be making a LinkedIn introduction. It's something really, really simple where you could impact somebody's life. So I think never underestimate the power that we all have to make change and to create a better world. And there's small things that we can all do in our lives, as well as more massive things that we can all do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's those little daily choices that sometimes can make all the difference. So being
Yeah.
mindful, really thinking about the impact of words, of policies, of the way we implement policies, of the conversations that we're having with people. There are countless opportunities to make a difference, to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So let's commit to doing that. Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you so much for being here, Janice. It was so good to
Thank
see
you
you
so much,
again.
Bridget. It was
Yes.
great to be here. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye, everybody.